If Kate Mulgrew's Star Trek Janeway happens, I hope it avoids Picard's big mistake. If a follow-up to Star Trek Voyager starring Kate Mulgrew as Admiral Janeway is in the works, I hope Star Trek Janeway avoids the big mistake that Star Trek Picard made. According to Trick Culture, Kate Mulgrew said she is pursuing talks regarding Janeway's return to the Star Trek franchise during the Evening with Kate Mulgrew panel on Star Trek Cruise 8. The floating convention celebrated Star Trek Voyager's 30th anniversary with an impressive, nearly complete Star Trek Voyager cast reunion. Star Trek's precedent for returning captains is Patrick Stewart's reprising Admiral Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek Picard, set 20 years after Star Trek Nemesis. Stewart believed Admiral Picard had different stories to tell in a new Star Trek show, so Picard was never intended to be a Star Trek The Next Generation reunion. Star Trek Picard lived up to this promise for 2 seasons, but still had TNG cameos like LT Commander Data Brent Spiner, Captain William Riker Jonathan Frakes, and Counselor Deanna Troi Marina Sirtis in Picard Season 1. And Q John B. Lanky and Guinan Whoopi Goldberg in Picard Season 2. Why Kate Mulgrew's Star Trek Janeway must avoid Picard's big mistake if it happens. Kate Mulgrew's potential Star Trek Janeway show must avoid making Star Trek Picard's big mistake, forgetting that what made Star Trek The Next Generation special was the crew of the USS Enterprise D. Picard Season 3's Star Trek The Next Generation cast reunion finally gave Admiral Picard the follow-up that he deserved. Bringing back the TNG cast let Picard Season 3 focus on tighter, character-driven stories instead of repeating earlier problems with pacing and underdeveloped characters. Star Trek Janeway could identify what made Star Trek Voyager successful and apply it to a 25th century Star Trek story. Star Trek Voyager's appeal was its premise, but Star Trek Janeway wouldn't have to get lost in the Delta Quadrant again to recreate Voyager's successful formula. 7 years in the Delta Quadrant would have almost certainly changed the USS Voyager's crew. They experienced things that no other Starfleet crew had. Star Trek Janeway could address the Voyager crew's experiences adjusting to Alpha Quadrant life. Applying a modern television lens to Star Trek Voyager's aftermath has the potential to be a stunning psychological study of PTSD, trauma bonds, and survival. Most importantly, it would feature Star Trek Voyager's cast reunited, facing challenges together. What Kate Mulgrew says about Star Trek Janeway and how it mirrors Jerry Ryan's 7 of 9 comeback in Picard. Kate Mulgrew doesn't want Admiral Janeway's live-action Star Trek return to be a vanity project, mirroring what Jerry Ryan expressed about 7 of 9's comeback in Star Trek Picard. Both Star Trek Voyager alumni are interested in reprising their Voyager roles in service of the right story for their characters. Both Ryan and Mulgrew know that fans have high expectations for 7 and Janeway. Ryan turned down a different Star Trek spin-off that wasn't the hotly demanded Star Trek Legacy. Mulgrew, likewise, wants to do a story that gives fans hope, like she did in Star Trek Prodigy. Star Trek Prodigy was a storytelling triumph for Star Trek that utilized legacy characters like Janeway expertly, with Mulgrew in dual roles in the USS Protostar crew's supporting cast. Currently, Star Trek Prodigy is neither canceled nor renewed for a 3rd season on Netflix, which puts Admiral Janeway's Star Trek future in limbo. There's a gravitational pull in the Star Trek universe, a tendency to bring legacy characters back for one more mission, one final philosophical dilemma, one last look into the stars. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Other times it feels like the warp core is leaking nostalgia and drowning everything in its path. When Star Trek Picard was announced, it promised to give fans the swan song they never got from The Next Generation. Patrick Stewart returned with gravitas, and the idea of a more cerebral, slower-paced Trek seemed bold and promising. But for many longtime fans, the series stumbled, especially in its first 2 seasons, not because it dared to be different, but because it forgot what Star Trek is for. And that's precisely the mistake any future Star Trek Janeway series must avoid. The legacy of Janeway. Janeway, played with razor-sharp intelligence and warmth by Kate Mulgrew, remains one of the franchise's most unique and underappreciated captains. She was a scientist with the fire of a starship captain, a mother figure in the Delta Quadrant, and a woman who had to rewrite the rulebook daily just to keep her crew alive. Star Trek. Voyager may not have had the prestige of TNG or the gravitas of DS9, but Janeway was never the problem. If anything, she was the anchor that kept the series on course. With Mulgrew returning to voice Janeway in Star Trek Prodigy, there's renewed momentum and fan appetite for a live-action return. The idea of Star Trek Janeway isn't just a pipe dream. It's something fans have been whispering about at conventions and online forums for years. But if the series ever materializes, it needs to learn from Picard's missteps. The problem with Picard started with promise, but quickly got lost in the weeds of its own high-concept storytelling. It traded the optimistic tone of The Next Generation for a dystopian aesthetic more reminiscent of Blade Runner than Star Trek. Instead of diplomacy, exploration, and moral quandaries, we got synthetic apocalypses, graphic violence, and convoluted timelines. What was once a thoughtful captain's log became a streaming-era action series, desperately trying to be prestige television. The irony is bitter. Star Trek, which once set the standard for smart, future-facing television, ended up chasing trends rather than setting them. Characters like Seven of Nine, once defined by layers of growth and struggle, were reduced to gritty vigilantes. And Picard himself, stoic, principled, deeply ethical, was often sidelined in his own show, his wisdom drowned out by the noise around him. The series eventually corrected course in Season 3, offering a more heartfelt and ensemble-driven farewell. But the damage was done. The first 2 seasons had taken a sharp left turn from the essence of Trek, and the show never fully recovered its balance. Janeway deserves better. If Star Trek Janeway happens, it has a rare chance to restore what made Star Trek great, not by repeating the past, but by understanding it. Janeway doesn't need to be gritty to be compelling. She doesn't need a body count to be formidable. She just needs to be Janeway, principled, adaptable, fiercely intelligent, and always just a bit haunted by the impossible choices she's had to make. Rather than thrusting her into another galaxy-ending crisis, let her deal with smaller stakes that echo larger ideas. Imagine Janeway as an admiral mentoring a new generation of captains. Picture her navigating the political minefields of the post-Dominion War era, advocating for diplomacy over war, ethics over expedience. Give her a crew, new and diverse, and let her once again be the example that the Federation needs. And most importantly, keep the spirit of Star Trek alive. The best episodes of Voyager weren't the ones with Borg cubes and phaser fights. They were the episodes where Janeway had to weigh the prime directive against compassion, or when she debated the morality of sacrificing one life to save many. That's the Janeway fans want to see again. A future worth hoping for. Kate Mulgrew has shown nothing but love for the character of Janeway. Her return in Prodigy proves she still has the passion and the presence to command a starship or an entire fleet. But the story has to be worthy of her. It must honor her legacy without turning her into a caricature. It must embrace hope over cynicism, exploration over explosions. And it must recognize that what made Janeway great wasn't just her strength, it was her humanity. If Star Trek Janeway happens, I hope the writers remember the stars are not just for spectacle. They're for reflection. Therefore,